What would you do if you rode into a valley with nothing left to your name, and the clerk at the land office slid a paper across the counter saying an entire homestead was yours for the price of a signature? That is what happened to Charles Walker, 39 years old, saddle sore and stripped of every dollar he had ever earned, when he came down out of the pass into Pine Hollow with the first hard frost of the year. He signed for a cabin no one else would touch, on ground everyone in the valley had already given up on. But what he would find beneath its plank floor by lantern light would shake the whole valley before spring. So settle in and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The wind out of the north had been at his back for 3 days when Charles first saw Pine Hollow spread beneath him. It was not much of a town. A crooked main street of gray plank buildings, a livery, a mercantile, a saloon leaning ever so slightly to the east, and a small white church at the far end where the road gave up and turned to pasture. Beyond it, the valley opened wide, ringed on 3 sides by pine ridges already dusted white. His mare, an aging bay named June, blew steam into the cold air and shook her mane, and Charles patted her neck with a gloved hand that had known better coats than the one he wore. He had come from Kansas, where a bad partner and a worse winter had taken the small ranch he had spent 12 years building. He had buried his wife there 3 summers back, in a plot beneath a cottonwood, and after that, the ranch had never quite felt like his again. When the note came due and the sheriff arrived with papers, Charles had loaded what he could onto June's saddle and ridden west because west was the direction that asked no questions. He rode down into the town at mid-morning. The people he passed did not stare exactly, but they marked him. A man in a worn duster on a tired horse with no pack-horse behind him and no coin jingling in his belt was a familiar figure in these hills, and none of the figures had ever amounted to much. Charles tied June at the rail outside a small building whose faded sign read Land Office, brushed the road dust from his sleeves, and pushed open the door. The clerk behind the counter was a small, spectacled man with ink on his knuckles. He looked up, took Charles in without expression, and said, "Passing through." "Looking," Charles said. "For what?" "Land, under the claim." The clerk lifted an eyebrow, pulled a heavy ledger from beneath the counter, and thumbed it open. His finger ran down a column of crossed-out entries, then stopped near the bottom, where a single line was still open. He tapped it twice with his fingernail, and something passed across his face that was not quite a smile. "There's the Hadley place," he said. 2 miles north, up against the tree line. Cabin, cellar, 40 acres. Been abandoned 9 years. He paused. "Nobody's taken it. Nobody will." Charles waited. "Family walked off it one winter and never came back," the clerk said. "Story around here is the ground won't hold a crop and the cabin won't hold a man past January." He shrugged. "It's free if you want it. Sign here and it's yours." Charles looked at the line on the page. The name of the family had been struck through in a neat black bar, but he could still read it beneath the ink. Hadley. He thought of his own name being struck from a Kansas ledger only weeks before, and something tightened low in his chest. He took the offered pen. The nib scratched. He signed Charles Walker in a plain, steady hand. The clerk blotted the ink. "You're the first in 9 years," he said. "There's talk about that place. You'll hear it soon enough." "I expect I will," Charles said. Outside, word moved the way it always moves in a small town. By the time he crossed the street toward the mercantile for salt and coffee and a sack of flour, 2 men on the saloon porch had already turned to watch him. One of them, a broad man in a fine wool coat with a silver watch chain crossing his belly, laughed out loud when he heard. "The Hadley ground," the man called, loud enough for the whole street. "Boys, we got a new fool in the valley." Charles did not turn. He tied his purchases to June's saddle, mounted slow, and rode north out of town with the laughter still riding the air behind him. He did not look back. June's hooves rang on the frozen road, and the ridges leaned in around him, and somewhere ahead, past a bend he could not yet see, a weathered cabin waited with its cellar door closed against 9 winters of snow. Would you have signed that paper? Would you have ridden north toward a cabin the whole valley called cursed, with laughter chasing your back and nothing but a tired horse to keep you company? If a story like this settles into you the way a good fire does, take a moment to leave a comment below and subscribe so you can ride the rest of the trail with us. Because what Charles Walker was about to find beneath those plank floorboards would turn Pine Hollow inside out before the snow was gone. The laughter did not stop when Charles rounded the bend. It followed him the way wood smoke follows a man who has stood too long by the fire, clinging to the wool of his coat, riding in the fibers of his hat. He knew that kind of laughter. He had heard it in Kansas the week before the sheriff came, from men who had once tipped their brims to him in the street. Laughter in a small town was its own weather. It moved on the wind and settled on the porches and hung in the doorways of the Mercantile long after the mouth that made it had gone quiet. Half a mile out of town he heard hooves behind him and slowed. A rider came up alongside, an older man on a lean gray gelding, wearing a long dark coat and a hat that had seen more seasons than most men see in a lifetime. His beard was white and neat. His eyes were the pale color of creek ice. He did not offer a name. He did not tip his hat. He only rode beside Charles for a long stretch of the frozen road, quiet, matching June's pace as though he had been doing it all his life. At the fork where the road split toward the tree line, the old man drew his horse in and stopped. Charles stopped too. The wind moved the pines above them with a sound like slow water. "You headed to the Hadley place," the old man said. It was not a question. "I am," Charles said. The old man looked past him, up toward the ridge, and his pale eyes narrowed against the light. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was spare and formal, almost measured, as though he had carried the words for years, waiting for the man who needed them. "What that family left behind," he said, "was not the ground." Charles waited for more. None came. The old man touched the brim of his hat once, turned his gray gelding, and rode back the way he had come, his coat dark against the pale road, growing smaller until the bend swallowed him. Charles sat a long moment with the wind in his face, turning the sentence over the way a man turns a stone in his palm, feeling for the shape of it. He could make nothing of it. He tucked it away behind his teeth and clucked June forward. Behind him, in Pine Hollow, the broad man in the fine wool coat had already made his way inside the saloon and set his elbows on the plank bar. His name, Charles would learn later, was Harlan Boone, and he owned the freight line, the Mercantile's back lot, and a good portion of the flat pasture south of town. Boone had wanted the Hadley acreage for years, not for its soil, but for the water that crossed its northern corner, and he had counted on the valley's fear to keep the ground unclaimed until he could take it for a song. He set his glass down hard when the clerk's news reached him, and he laughed the way big men laugh when they mean to be heard. 9 winters, he said to the room. 9 winters that ground has sat, and now some saddle tramp out of Kansas thinks he'll break it with a spade. He shook his head. He'll be back through here by February begging for a bunk. Mark it. The men around him laughed on cue, the way men do around a purse. One of them muttered that the Hadley place had bad air in it, that a child had gone missing there, that the mother had wept in the church for 3 Sundays before they walked off it and vanished. Boone waved the talk down and grinned. "Bad air or good, that water is mine before spring." The talk moved from the saloon to the Mercantile porch, and from the porch to the smithy, and from the smithy to the wash line behind the boarding house, the way talk always moves. By dusk, every soul in Pine Hollow knew a man named Walker had signed for the cursed ground, and every soul had an opinion, and every opinion agreed that the ground would send him packing before the thaw. Charles knew none of that yet. He only knew the road, and the light going thin, and June's slow, steady breath beneath him as the trees closed in on either side. The last 2 miles were the hardest. The road narrowed to a wagon track, then to a trail, then to a suggestion of a trail beneath a thin skin of old snow. The pines grew close, and the wind fell off, and the world grew quiet in the way that only high country goes quiet, a silence with weight in it. June's ears turned back once and then forward again, and Charles put a gloved hand on her neck and left it there. He came on the cabin the way a man comes on a grave he had not known was there. It stood in a small clearing at the foot of the ridge, low and long, its logs gone silver with age, its roof sagging at one end where a beam had given up, its single window blind with dust behind cracked glass. A stone chimney climbed the north wall. A door hung slightly off its top hinge. Behind the cabin, half swallowed by dead grass and drift, he could make out the square outline of a cellar door set into the earth, its planks weathered to the color of bone, its iron ring dulled to rust. Beyond that, the ridge climbed pale and dark against a sky the color of pewter. He sat June a long time and looked at it. He had expected worse. He had expected better. The truth of the place sat somewhere between, quiet and patient, waiting to be dealt with. He dismounted stiffly and led June to a lean-to at the side of the cabin. The lean-to still had half a roof and 3 walls, which was more than he had hoped for. He unsaddled her, rubbed her down with a handful of dry grass, and set the sack of flour and the salt and the coffee inside the cabin door before he did anything else, because that was the order a man learned when he had lost things before. Provisions first, horse next, man last. The cabin door swung inward with a low complaint. Inside, the air was still and cold, and smelled of old wood and mice and something fainter beneath, something like lamp oil that had soaked into the boards a long time ago and never quite left. A stone hearth stood at the north wall, its iron crane still in place. A plank table lay on its side in the middle of the floor. A tin cup sat on the hearthstone, upright, as though someone had set it down and stepped outside for a moment. 9 winters passed and never come back. Charles righted the table. He set the cup on it. He went out and gathered wood from the fallen limbs at the edge of the clearing until his arms ached, and he split what he could with the small axe from his roll, and he built a fire in the cold hearth and coaxed it until the flue drew and the smoke climbed and the first true warmth in 3 days touched his hands. He did not open the cellar door that night. He looked at it once, from the back step, in the last blue light, and he felt the old man's sentence move through him again like a cold current. What that family left behind was not the ground. He turned back inside and shut the door. He ate cold biscuit and drank hot coffee and slept on the plank floor near the fire with his coat over him and his hat under his head. And in the long hours before dawn, he heard the cabins speak the way old buildings speak, a soft settling, a small creak, a sound almost like a footfall from somewhere below him that made June's ear flick once in the dark and made Charles open his eyes and listen a long time to the silence that followed. Morning came pale and slow, a thin gray light sliding through the cracked window and laying itself across the plank floor in a long, uneven bar. Charles sat up stiffly, listened once more, and heard nothing but the low crackle of what remained of his fire and the soft blow of June out in the lean-to. He rose, stirred the coals, added a limb, and stood a moment looking at the boards beneath his boots. The sound had come from below him. He was certain of that much. He had lived in enough old houses to know the difference between a beam settling in the cold and a weight shifting in a hollow space, and what he had heard in the black hour before dawn had been the second thing. He went outside and tended to June first. He rubbed her flanks with a handful of dry grass, checked her hooves, spoke low into the warm crook of her neck the way he always had. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a slow breath and let it out again. Then he walked around to the back of the cabin, to where the cellar door lay set into the earth, and stood over it in the pale morning with his hands in his coat pockets. He did not lift it. He only looked. The planks were the color of bone, as he had seen the evening before, and the iron ring was rusted through in one spot where a small crescent of daylight showed beneath. Snow had drifted against the low side of the door and thawed and frozen again many times over, and the seam where door met earth was packed hard with ice and pine needles and the small brown skeletons of last year's grass. It was the sort of door a man could pass 100 times and never think of. But there, just above the iron ring, cut shallow into the top plank and softened by 9 winters of weather, was a mark. Charles knelt and brushed the frost from it with the edge of his glove. 2 letters, joined at the crossbar, An H and a small letter beside it he could not quite read. Below the letters, a shape that might have been a bird in flight or the peak of a distant ridge, cut by a careful hand with a small knife. It was not a builder's mark. It was not a brand. It was the sort of thing a child carves when a father is not looking, or that a father carves for a child who will look for it later. Charles stayed on one knee a long moment. He thought of the child the saloon man had spoken of in a town he had not yet learned to hear, of a mother who wept in a church 3 Sundays. He did not yet know these things. He only knew that the mark had been made with love, and that whoever made it had believed they would come back to see it. He stood and did not lift the door. He walked instead around the perimeter of the cabin, slow, deliberate, letting his eyes take in what the failing light of the evening before had hidden. The north wall was sound. The east wall sagged where the roof beam had failed. The west wall carried a line of small pegs driven into the logs at shoulder height, spaced evenly, 6 of them, as though tools had once hung there in an order somebody had known by heart. And on the south side, low near the ground where the log met the sill, someone had scratched a date into the wood with the tip of a nail. He crouched to read it. A year, 9 winters back. And beneath the year, in the same shaky hand, one word: waiting. Charles rose and stood a long time with his hand on the log. Then he walked back to June and gave her the last of the oats from his roll and told her, quiet, that they would stay. He set to work that same morning because work was the only prayer he had left, and because a man who begins to think too long in a place like that will lose his nerve before noon. He carried the plank table outside and let the wind take the dust from it. He swept the cabin floor with a bundle of pine needles tied with twine. He climbed to the sagging end of the roof and studied the failed beam, and he saw at once that it had not simply given under snow. It had been notched wrong at one end, cut short, wedged with a smaller piece to make up the difference, as though the man who set it had run out of good timber and had meant to come back and replace it before the next winter. He had not come back. Charles ran a gloved finger along the wedge, and something in his chest tightened at the small, hopeful failure of it. He rode June down to the creek at the northern corner of the property that afternoon, and he saw the water Harlan Boone wanted, though he did not yet know the man had a name. The creek ran clear and quick even under a skin of ice at the edges, and it turned in a slow bend where a stand of young alders had grown up in the years since anyone had cut back. He knelt and drank from his cupped hand, and the water tasted of stone and pine and something faintly sweet beneath. June drank beside him. Her ear flicked once toward the ridge. Over the next several days, Charles worked from first light to last. He mended the door to swing true again on both hinges by driving a new pin cut from a green oak branch. He cleared the stove flue with a length of chain wrapped in burlap. He pulled the dead grass from the lean-to and stretched a piece of canvas from his roll across the open side to break the wind for June. He walked the 40 acres in widening circles and read the ground the way another man might read a book, and he saw where a garden had been laid out in neat rows once, and where a small orchard of 4 apple trees still stood at the western edge, 3 of them dead at the top but living low, one of them scarred by a bear a long time ago and grown crooked around the wound. Every place he set his hands, the ground gave up another small thing, a hoe blade without a handle beside the garden, a child's tin whistle in the grass by the apple trees, green with age but still holding its shape, a row of stones set at even intervals along the north fence line, each one about the size of a man's fist, each one placed with intention. He gathered these things and set them on the plank table inside the cabin, and did not yet ask himself what they meant together. June followed him at a slow drift as he worked, cropping what dry grass she could find, lifting her head sometimes to watch him with the patient dark eye of a horse who has known one man too long to leave him. In the evenings she stood at the edge of the lean-to and watched the cellar door, and Charles noticed this without saying so, and he noticed too that she never once put her weight on the ground directly above it, as though the earth there was a thing to be walked around rather than across. On the 4th night, kneeling by the hearth to bank his fire, he heard the sound again from below, softer this time, almost like breath. He set his palm flat on the plank floor and felt nothing. He stayed there a long time with his hand on the wood, and when he finally rose, he did not sleep, and he did not open the door, and he understood that he was already, in some way he could not yet name, keeping a promise to somebody he had never met. On the 5th morning, Charles took the lantern down from its peg, checked the wick, filled its brass belly with kerosene from the small tin he had carried in his roll, and carried it out to the cellar door with a pry bar and the small axe. The sky was low and gray, and the wind had gone still, the way it goes still before snow. He knelt beside the door and worked the ice out of the seam with the pry bar, patient, chip by chip, until the iron ring lifted free of the frozen ground. He set his boots on either side of the frame, took hold of the ring with both gloved hands, and pulled. The door came up slow and heavy. A breath of cold, older air rose out of the dark and touched his face, and he smelled root cellar and stone and something sweeter beneath, like dried apples kept too long. He lit the lantern, held it low over the opening, and looked down. 6 plank steps led into a small square room dug into the earth and lined with creekstone. He went down. The lantern light moved across the walls in slow pieces. A shelf of clay crocks along the north side, most of them cracked, one still sealed with wax gone dark. A wooden bin in the corner with a lid half fallen in. A pair of small boots set neatly against the far wall, their toes turned to the door, waiting. Charles stood a long moment looking at those boots. Then he lifted the lantern higher. Above the boots, at the height of a child, someone had scratched into the earthen wall a row of thin vertical lines, the way a person marks days. He counted them. 23. After the 23rd, the mark stopped, and beneath them was carved, in the same shaky hand as the log on the south wall, the word Papa. Charles set the lantern on the shelf and lowered himself to one knee. He stayed that way a while. Then he began to look, careful, the way a man looks at his own wife's things after she is gone. In the bin, under the fallen lid, he found a folded quilt, mouse-nibbled at one corner, wrapped around a small carved horse of pine, its mane cut with a knife. Beneath the quilt, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin. He lifted it out and set it on the shelf beside the lantern and worked the lid loose with the point of his knife. Inside the tin were letters, 6 of them, tied with a length of blue thread. And beneath the letters a folded page of ledger paper, and beneath that a small canvas pouch that gave in his hand with the soft weight of coin. He read the top letter first, by lantern light, kneeling on the earth floor. The hand was a woman's, careful and slanted. It was dated 9 winters back, and it was addressed to no one, and it began, "If any Christian soul finds this, know that we did not leave willingly." He read on. She wrote of a man who had come to the door in the fall with papers he claimed the county had signed, of a night the barn had burned, of a child who had gone to the creek for water at first light and had not come back by dark. She wrote of the searching. She wrote of the way the valley had turned its face. She wrote that she had buried what money her husband had put by beneath the cellar step, and that she was leaving it there because the man who had come to the door had said he would have this ground before spring, and she would sooner give it to the earth than to him. She signed the letter with a first name Charles did not know and the surname Hadley. He set the letter down. He unfolded the ledger page. It was a claim receipt, dated the same fall, in the name of Hadley, marked paid in full, and stamped by a county seal Charles recognized from his own folded paper in his coat. The Hadleys had owned this ground outright. Whatever the man at their door had shown them had been a lie. Charles sat back on his heel. The lantern light moved slow across the small boots and the counted marks and the carved horse laid on its side in the quilt. He thought of a mother in a church weeping for 3 Sundays. He thought of a broad man, in a fine wool coat, laughing on a saloon porch. He thought of the water at the northern corner, running clear under the ice. He did not open the pouch. He tied the letters back together with the blue thread and folded them into the tin with the ledger page and the pouch and closed the lid and carried the tin up the plank steps into the gray daylight and shut the cellar door behind him. He stood in the yard a long time with the tin under his arm and the wind cold on his face, and he understood then what the old man on the road had meant. What that family left behind was not the ground. The snow came that night. It came without wind at first, a slow, steady fall through the blue hour that softened every edge of the clearing, and then, near midnight, the wind rose out of the north and drove the snow sideways against the cabin logs and the canvas over the lean-to. Charles fed the fire and sat with the tin on the plank table before him and did not open it again. June stamped once in the lean-to and was still. Near the second hour past midnight, he heard a sound that was not the wind, a thin sound. A voice, or the shape of one, out beyond the clearing, carried and lost and carried again. He rose, pulled his coat on, took the lantern, and went out into the storm. The snow was already to his shin. He put his back to the wind and walked the edge of the clearing, calling once, twice, listening. The lantern light reached only a few yards into the white. He was about to turn back when he saw a dark shape low against the base of a pine at the tree line. No bigger than a folded coat. It was a woman. She was on her knees in the snow with her arms around a small bundle held tight to her chest, and she was so cold she could not stand. Charles knelt beside her, got his arm under hers, lifted her, and half carried her back across the clearing with the wind pushing at their backs and the lantern swinging wild in his other hand. She spoke against his shoulder, a word he could not catch. The bundle in her arms was a child, wrapped in a shawl, alive, breathing shallow against her collarbone. He got them inside and shut the door on the storm. He set the woman by the hearth and built the fire high, took the child from her arms and laid it in the quilt from the cellar bin, unwrapped the outer shawl, chafed the small hands between his own. The child was maybe 4 years old, a boy, and his lips were the color of ash, but his breath was steady. Charles set water to warm in the tin cup on the crane. The woman watched him from the hearthstones with wide, dark eyes. Her lips moved. "Wagon broke," she said. 2 miles back." "Husband," Charles said. "Following," she said. "On foot." Charles took his coat from the peg by the door, put it on again, took the lantern, looked once at the woman and the boy by the fire, and stepped back out into the snow. He found the husband a mile down the trail, sitting against a fallen pine with one leg turned wrong beneath him and his hands tucked under his arms. The man raised his head when the lantern reached him and tried to stand, and could not. Charles got a shoulder under him, lifted, and walked him the mile back through drifts to his thigh, stopping twice to let the man breathe. By the time they reached the cabin door, the first thin gray of morning had come into the storm, and June stamped once in the lean-to as they passed. Inside, the woman had wrapped the boy tighter and was feeding him warm water from the tin cup, drop by drop. The husband sank by the hearth and wept without sound when he saw them. Charles set the leg with 2 straight limbs from the woodpile and strips torn from a clean flour sack, and the man bit down on his own glove and did not cry out. The storm broke by midday. By the second afternoon, the husband could sit up. He said his name was Miller, that he was a wheelwright out of the North Country moving his family to a cousin's ranch beyond the pass, and that they had turned off the road for shelter when the wind rose. Charles gave them the cabin and slept in the lean-to beside June, with his coat over him. On the third morning, Charles saddled June and rode into Pine Hollow with the tin under his arm. The valley lay under fresh snow, and the sky had cleared to a hard blue. He tied June outside the land office and went in. The clerk looked up from his ledger, saw Charles's face, and set down his pen. Charles laid the 6 letters on the desk, then the folded ledger page, then the claim receipt beside the clerk's own book. The clerk read the top letter and did not speak for a long time. He opened his heavy ledger to the Hadley entry and looked at the black bar of ink over the name and back at the receipt in his hand. "Paid in full," the clerk said. 9 winters back." "Yes," Charles said. "Then the claim I struck through was never open to strike." The clerk's ink-stained fingers trembled once on the page. This was theft dressed as law. Word went out from the land office the way word had gone out about Charles in the fall, only slower now and heavier. By afternoon there were 3 men on the land office porch, then 7, then a small crowd standing in the packed snow of the crooked main street. The old man from the fork road stood among them in his long dark coat, his pale eyes on Charles, and said nothing, and touched the brim of his hat. Harlan Boone came down from the saloon with his silver watch chain across his belly and his fine wool coat buttoned to the throat. He looked at the papers on the clerk's desk through the open door, and his broad face went the color of old tallow. He did not laugh. He stood a long time on the porch step with one hand on the rail, and then he took off his hat, which no man in Pine Hollow had seen him do, and he said, "I did not know it went that far." He said it once, and did not say it again. He walked back to the saloon alone, and by the end of the week, he had sold the freight line to a younger man from over the pass and had ridden south, and the valley let him go. A circuit judge came into Pine Hollow the following week on a lean sorrel with a leather satchel across his knees. He read the letters at the clerk's desk and asked Charles 2 quiet questions and wrote for a long time in a bound book. When he had finished, he set his pen down and said, "The ground is yours by claim, and the coin in the pouch is yours by finding, and the Hadley name will be written back into this ledger clean." He said it the way a doctor names a mending bone. Charles thanked him, and did not open the pouch even then. The Millers stayed until the wheelwright could walk without the splint. On the morning they left for the pass in a borrowed wagon, the woman put her hand on Charles's sleeve at the door and said, "You went back out." Charles said, "Anyone would." She shook her head once and did not answer, and the boy in the wagon bed lifted the small carved pine horse Charles had given him and held it up in the winter sun. By the first thaw, a stone had been set at the edge of the clearing under the crooked apple tree, cut by the smith in Pine Hollow at no charge, carved with the Hadley name and the year they had walked off the ground. The mother's letters Charles kept in the tin on the mantel above the hearth. The 23 marks in the cellar wall he left as they were. The coin from the pouch he carried to the clerk, and asked that it be held against the day any Hadley kin might be found, and the clerk wrote it into the ledger in a careful hand. Spring came slow to the valley. Charles turned the old garden rows with a borrowed plow and planted oats and potatoes and set new pins in the 4 apple trees. The failed roof beam he replaced with a straight length of pine cut from the ridge, notched true. Neighbors he had not met began riding up the trail with small things, a sack of seed, a laying hen in a crate, a length of stovepipe, a jar of honey. They did not stay long, and they did not speak much. They set the thing down on the plank table and touched the brim of their hats and rode back down. On an evening at golden hour, near the end of that first spring, Charles stood at the edge of the clearing with June beside him and looked at the cabin with its mended door and its true roof and the stone under the apple tree and the creek beyond running clear. The old man from the fork road had ridden up that afternoon with a cutting from his own orchard, had set it in the ground himself, and had said only, "Now you know," and had ridden back down. June leaned her head against Charles's shoulder and breathed out slow. Charles laid a hand on her neck. "I did not claim this ground," he said quietly, to no one and to her. "I only kept it for the ones who did." The light turned the ridge to copper and the cabin logs to amber, and Charles stood a while longer in the still air, and then he turned and led June to the lean-to for the night. "Thank you for staying with Charles all the way to the last light, and for walking this quiet road of loss made whole through patience and keeping faith with the forgotten. If this story warmed you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next tale waiting down the trail.